Next, our last presenter for today, last but definitely not least, and I enjoy her immensely, is Dr. Mary Ruwart. Her biop on activity in the Libertarian Party is quite extensive. She began as an activist or volunteer in 1982. Been a platform committee member. I can remember at the Chicago convention, she was one of the contenders for the vice presidential nomination. Was runner-up for Kalamazoo City Commission in '83. Represented state rep candidate on the Libertarian Party in 1986. She also was endorsed by a major paper, the Detroit News, in 1990 for the state Board of Education. And because of her vote total, that office, the LP stayed on the ballot for the '92 election. Professionally, Mary has a BS in biochemistry, a PhD in biophysics. Most recently, she spent a number of years, from '76 through almost 20 years then, with the Upjohn a company of Kalamazoo as a senior research scientist involving in new therapies for treating a variety of diseases, including AIDS, but now has left Upjohn, and now she's pursuing a career in consulting and writing, and probably also enjoying life a little bit more. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Mary Ruwart.
Thank you, Steve. Can everyone hear me in the back? Well, I always enjoy coming to Ohio because even though I'm currently in Kentucky, you're so close and you're so active and you invite me back so many times that I really appreciate it, and I feel like it's my second home. Now, I don't know that Steve really told you what I'm going to talk about today, but my talk title is quite bold: Why Libertarian Victory is Inevitable. And you may wonder how I can stand before you and make such a bold claim, because in some ways it seems like every day we're losing more and more of our freedoms. In fact, you really don't need to know the issues at all. You simply have to look at your paycheck and notice the ever-increasing tax burden. Your paycheck shrinks as government grows, and in addition to that, your dollar is worth less and less because of the deficit spending. And so as inflation increases, what you have decreases. I may wonder how I can conclude that a libertarian victory is inevitable. But before we get too discouraged, we need to look at the big picture. 2,000 years ago, slavery was universal. It was practiced in almost every country. In fact, in many countries, it was the philosophy that civilization could not exist without slavery. Today, however, slavery is considered immoral and impractical. Now, this transition in the way the world viewed slavery was sometimes bloody, but for the most part, the transition was gradual and more or less peaceful. Slavery simply faded away as people began to understand that it just didn't work. 200 years ago, a scant 200 years ago, most of the countries of the world were ruled by a monarchy. When the 13 colonies rebelled and became the United States of America, everyone thought that they wouldn't last very long because everyone knew you had to have a king, a powerful monarch, or you simply would be overtaken and cease to exist. Of course, today we know better. Rule by one individual or by a family is considered immoral and impractical, just as slavery once was. Now, the transition was sometimes bloody, but for the most part, it was rather peaceful and happened over a period of years. And so today, monarchy, like slavery, is an institution of the past. Now we come to today, where we hear often the phrase that nothing is certain but death and taxes. And of course, as libertarians, we're beginning to question if taxes are even necessary. It wasn't so very long ago, a mere decade ago, that the public thought we were rather crazy if we suggested abolishing the IRS. And yet, today we see Republican presidential hopefuls suggesting the same thing to very generous applause. So when we look at things over the long term, when we look at the evolution of the history of freedom, we see that it's clear there is a tendency towards more liberty, towards more respect for the individual. As with most change, however, sometimes we take one step backward for every two that we take forward. And I believe the United States is currently in its backward step and getting ready once again to take those 2 steps forward. Why, you might ask, does the world evolve towards liberty? The answer is simple. Liberty works. Aggression doesn't. To get elected, politicians continually promise things that only liberty can deliver. They promise these things: more jobs, better pay, clean environment, a more even distribution of wealth, and less crime, because that's what people want. However, politicians cannot force these things to happen. Only liberty can fulfill the promises that our politicians are making. Because liberty is the only thing that works, eventually it will triumph. People's desire for the good life will draw them towards liberty, and that's why a libertarian victory is inevitable. Now, what would a libertarian victory look like? Well, let's examine the record of the most successful party of the 20th century. Does anyone want to venture a guess which party that is? The Socialist Party. Ah, you know that. Because even though they've won very few elections, their idea of making the individual serve the state instead of the state serving the individual has radically changed the way we live in the United States today. The success of the Socialist Party has been our step backward in the evolution towards liberty. The moral of this story, though, is that we don't necessarily need to win elections. We simply have to infuse the ideas of liberty into the political mainstream. And we can do that by holding office or by having those who run for office hold our ideas. If people want what liberty can give them, you may ask why they turned to socialism in the first place. And the answer is that the proponents of socialism promised all the things that liberty actually delivers. Socialism, for example, promises that the environment will be kept natural and clean if big government is allowed to manage wildlife, establish parks, and control emissions. Yet in the 1930s, the Pennsylvania government actually paid bounty hunters to shoot hawks. It was an individual, Mrs. Rosalie Edge, who began the private sanctuary now known as Hawk Mountain, and actually fought off hunters who were trying to poach on her land. Similarly, in the 1920s, Oregon paid bounties to people who would hunt sea lions. It was a group of private individuals who bought up the only known breeding ground for the sea lions, now known as Sea Lion Caves, and protected this breeding ground from poachers. In both these cases, the government actually used taxpayer dollars to destroy wildlife, while private individuals protected it. But even when government forbids the killing of wildlife, the results are just as disastrous. In Kenya, for example, the elephant population went from 65,000 to 19,000 in the 1980s. Poachers took what they wanted. Protecting elephant herds was difficult, even though elephant hunting had been banned by the government. However, in neighboring Zimbabwe, people were allowed to own elephants and sell the ivory, tusks, and meat. They domesticated them. Suddenly, elephants were pampered and protected, just like our range cattle are. The elephant population increased from 30,000 to 43,000 while Kenya's elephant population was decreasing by 70%. The moral of this story is that government cannot protect wildlife, whether it bans hunting or encourages it. However, individual ownership can save the endangered species through the profit motive. Animals that are valuable to an individual will be animals with a dedicated protector. Property rights and the free market can protect what government decree cannot. Once again, liberty works. Socialism also promised to keep the air clean. But in Eastern Europe, where the government controlled industry and emissions, the air is much more polluted than in any free nation, or so-called free nation. National Geographic had a cover story on this tragedy with pictures of soot-covered individuals who literally turned black if they lived anywhere near the government facilities. In the U.S., the Defense Department is by far the heaviest polluter and has not been required to clean up their mess. How can we expect our greatest polluter to protect us from corporate polluters? Obviously, we can't. Only liberty, with its systems of property rights and victim compensation, can keep our air clean. Socialism promises even distribution of wealth, but studies show that the more freedom that exists in a country, the more even its distribution of wealth. Liberty has no minimum wages or licensing laws to keep the poor from working. Immigrants used to come to our shores to avoid the European guilds that prevented them from working in the career of their choice. In the U.S., these multitudes were free to earn, and that's why we became the richest nation on earth. There are always more poor than rich, and when you let the poor work, the amount of wealth creation is so great that any country that will permit its poor to work will become extremely wealthy. Once more, liberty works and big government doesn't. Perhaps the most striking recognition that we are evolving towards liberty and that people are beginning to understand these issues was found in the books Megatrends 2000. The Nesbitt's document how government regulation of the economy causes major problems and predict a partial return to liberty. They call this emerging trend free market socialism. Now, as they describe it, free market socialism is a relatively unregulated business economy. Taxation in the economy would still be high and would be used to provide a social safety net for welfare, education, etc. Megatrends 2000 documents the recognition that free markets are necessary to create wealth and eradicate poverty. Definitely a movement towards liberty. The term free market socialism does imply that people have not yet discovered that only liberty can provide the social safety net as well. But it's only a matter of time, I believe, before that recognition dawns. Socialism and big government are in deep trouble. Polls show that 69% of the American population agrees with this statement, quote, "When something is run by the government, it is usually inefficient and wasteful." 69% also agree with the statement, quote, "The federal government controls too much of our daily lives." 63% agree with the statement, quote, "Government regulation of business usually does more harm than good," end quote. 95% believe that government is wasting, quote, "quite a lot," end quote, or, quote, "a great deal," end quote, of their money. And 76% say they rarely or never trust the government to do what is right. 76%. A full 39% of the population believe the federal government has become so large and powerful that it poses an immediate threat to the rights and freedoms of ordinary citizens. America is beginning to realize that big government is the problem. It won't take too much deduction from there to see that liberty is the solution, even for the social safety net. The outcome is inevitable. And as more Americans are finding liberty, they're finding the Libertarian Party. In July of 1995, we were the subject of several major news articles. For example, here's the cover of Insight magazine, the stature of libertarians, with of course, the Statue of Liberty on it. And let me quote from USA Today on their title story called The Gen X Philosophy. Many reject party politics and lean libertarian. Quote, the individual should be the primary unit of society, end quote. The article goes on to say, and I'll read it for those of you who haven't seen it because it is so wonderful. Generation X has had enough of baby boom politics. As disillusioned 20-somethings see it, Democrats have buried them under $5 trillion worth of debt to support social programs that only fail. Republicans want to intrude upon their private lives by censoring the internet, restricting abortions, and arresting pot smokers. So many of the 41 million members of Generation X, the so-called baby busters born from 1965 to 1976, are there any in here? Okay. Are turning to an old philosophy that suddenly seems new, libertarianism, a mixture of liberal views on social issues and a conservative bent on pocketbook concerns. Quote, the old left-right paradigm is not working anymore, end quote, says Douglas Copeland, author of Generation X, the novel that gave the group its name. Quote, coming down the pipe are an extraordinarily large number of fiscal conservatives who are socially left, end quote. What liberalism was to the 60s and conservatism was to the 80s, libertarianism may be to the youth of the 1990s, the de facto philosophy of a generation steeped in the precepts of latchkey self-reliance and the individual freedoms of the internet. Quote, I don't think there's a lot of difference between Democrats and Republicans, end quote, says Mara Whalen, 27, a radio producer in Washington, D.C. Quote, they both want government to perform functions it has no business performing, end quote. She continues, in the 60s, youth asked the same government that had been oppressing them to solve all their problems. This monstrous bureaucracy that we have today is their legacy. It's their Frankenstein. And consistent with this article and this editorial comment is the often quoted studies done on the internet which shows that the libertarian politics is indeed dominating the internet and that Harry Browne, our front-running presidential candidate, appears to score very high in the polls, so high that he frequently wins them. So there are a lot of signs that the times are changing. But for many of us, we wonder, if a libertarian victory is inevitable, how can we help it along so that we can enjoy freedom in our time? Some of us are considerably older than the Generation Xers and would hope that we wouldn't have to wait until they come of age. Well, humor is sometimes the best teacher, so I'd like to take a look at where that leads. The USA Today article contained a couple of libertarian jokes that many of you probably have heard before. The first is, how many libertarians does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer, none. The market will take care of it. The second one, what is libertarian salad? The answer, let us alone. Now, like most good humor, these jokes have a fun twist and a serious message. Yes, the market takes care of the light bulb, but most people really don't understand how. They need concrete examples before they'll accept our generality. If we want to hasten liberty along, we must provide these examples. When I began writing Healing Our World, it was going to be a very small short book of about 100 pages because I felt that I would talk about philosophy and just include one or two relevant, practical examples. But when I started doing research, I found that there had been an immense amount of work done showing that liberty works in a variety of areas, a few of which I've mentioned to you today. And so the book expanded. And I found that people were, in general, very, very receptive to seeing examples of how liberty works, because although you and I might understand that the market can change the light bulb, this is a new concept to many people, and they really don't understand it. And so they need practical, concrete instances. And an open, honest answer with examples that they can verify, where they can check the references, really helps them to know that we're not just another Ponzi scheme. Remember that people have been lied to so many times by politicians that it really is very, very hard, regardless of which party banner you're running under, to have people take you seriously and take you at your word. So don't make them take you at your word. Give them the evidence. Let them be able to check it out. And you'll find when you run for office that you're the only candidate doing so. Now the other joke, what is libertarian salad? Let us alone? You know, many of us are individualists and loners by nature. But my friends, evolution favors the interactive person, the one who bonds with others, the one who works as a team so that they can get where they want to go. And part of the promise of liberty is the cooperation, cooperative relationships instead of coercive ones, trust instead of fear, love instead of hate. If we want to just be left alone, we've missed part of the benefits that liberty can bring to us. You know, I once had the opportunity to talk with a gentleman who was very, very much involved in big government, aggressive government, and in designing what we would call propaganda to convince people that they should do unto their neighbors before they did unto them. In other words, he was a proponent of aggressive government. And I had an opportunity to meet with this gentleman who incidentally was on one of the covers of Time magazine several years ago. And I asked him what his goals in life were. He said power and money. But since he had those already, I realized I had misstated my question. And so I tried again, and I asked him, what would make you happy? Because I could see that this gentleman, who had power and money, who was very much involved in selling the idea of socialism to the American people, was not a very happy man. And he said to me in a moment of what I must assume is great candor, that he felt very disconnected from humankind, that he no longer had that sense of community, that he did not feel he was part of the human race. And years later, as I reflected on this, I realized it really could be no other way. Because before you can advocate aggression towards someone else, you cause a separation. It's me and you, us and them. Because obviously you do not use aggression against yourself. Do not point a gun at your own head to force yourself to do things that you think you should do. That's something that you do to others. Others. Someone separate from yourself. And so when we practice aggression, hopefully we don't, but when an individual practices aggression, the first thing they're doing is separating themselves from others. And so they are denying themselves that sense of connectedness and community, which I believe is part and parcel of our human happiness. And so those who practice aggression destroy the very happiness they're attempting to get when they try to bend others to their will, when they try for power and money. Because for what reason do we seek those things? Only to enhance our own happiness. So ultimately, aggression doesn't work because it undermines the very goal that we're seeking. Only liberty can take us where we want to go. And that's why evolution drives us towards liberty. Our human nature, our desire for happiness, pushes us towards liberty and punishes us for our aggression. Ultimately, this is why a libertarian victory is inevitable. We may wander through the maze and may find many dead ends. We may go in circles for a while, but if we persist, we'll finally discover the way out of the labyrinth. Our founders claimed that our inalienable rights included life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I would go one step further. I would say the pursuit of happiness is only successful when there is liberty in our hearts. Thank you.
Is the mic ready, Greg? No, this is being videotaped, so if you have a question, please come up to the mic and identify yourself. And mic going after there. Yeah. Get it on.
I really enjoyed your speech. I was trying to figure out your last poetic metaphor, liberty in the heart, and I couldn't quite get it to compute, and that leads to a question. Do you see different kinds of freedom? Political freedom, which we're in this room all very aware of, freedom from the coercion of other men. Do you see other levels of freedom, like philosophical freedom, free will, or even spiritual freedom? Were you referring to that? And can you talk about the relationship between those things?
Thank you for your question. Yes, I was referring to liberty on several levels. When I say that we have to have liberty in our heart, at one level, at the physical level, it means that we do not force people to our will with guns. We do not initiate force or fraud against them. And that, of course, is the level at which most Libertarian Party discussion rests. Then there is what I would call an emotional level. And at that level, we may judge other people as bad people and create a disconnection. Now, I realize in the Libertarian Party there's a lot of discussion of good and evil and right and wrong. And I guess the way I would say it is that if you wish to judge an action as good or evil because it takes you to ends you'd rather not have, that's fine. But if you judge a person as evil, then you've really cut off communication with that person. And I really believe there are no evil people, only ignorant people. Now, why do I say that? Well, even a Hitler being aggressor is doing something that ultimately hurts himself. By his aggression, he's ultimately forfeiting the happiness he could have. And so he's harming himself as well. Now, if we, as libertarians, recognizing the, quote, evil of his actions, say that he's evil, then we stop talking to him, don't we? We stop remembering that maybe he was a child that was abused and never had an opportunity to really understand. And I guess the way I think of it is as a child. Only a child does something that harms themselves in our, quote, ideal world. We hope that when we're mature, we're doing things that are beneficial to ourselves. And so for people that commit evil acts, rather than judge them as evil, I would look on them with pity because they are doing something not only to hurt others, but to hurt themselves. And when we take that position, we're in sympathy with them. We're not separate. And then we can talk to them, and we can at least make the attempt to teach them. Now, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that any one of us could have talked to Hitler and dissuaded him from doing what he did. I suspect that there were words, or there were people, or there was some method of persuasion that would have helped him see the light, and we may or may not know it. But my belief, and I find it a useful belief, is that there's always a way. And the reason it's a useful belief is because you maintain that person in your community of humankind. You don't cut them off, and then you have a chance with them. You at least have a chance. And so I think that that level of liberty in your heart also refers to judgment. I have been reading about another kind of liberty at the what I would call the spiritual level, which I cannot speak to you of in great detail since I don't think I have fully experienced it. However, it is the level at which we do not let others determine our reactions. We are free to choose our own reactions. Let me give you what I perceive in my understanding to be an example of this. Let us say that people have always criticized me because I'm short. And so I'm very sensitive about this. And all someone has to do to get my goat is say, "Oh, you're short," and I go into a tirade. Now notice all they have to do is push my button and I react. I'm not in control. I'm not free. I'm their slave because of my own beliefs, because of my own past that I have not recognized and dealt with. But if I am spiritually free, I look at that and say, oh, people called me short and that used to upset me, and I have a choice whether it upsets me or not. I don't have to pay attention to them. I don't have to think that just because I'm short, I'm bad, just because they think it. I have another freedom here. And so when I say that for our happiness we need liberty in our heart, I suspect we need it at a variety of levels, physical, emotional, and spiritual.
One more question, if there is. Yes, Paul?
First of all, let me say you look a lot taller in person. Secondly, you talked about having freedom in your heart, and it would seem to some of us that a lot of the people that we know have freedom in their heart as exemplified by the fact that they would not initiate force against their neighbors in neighborhood-type things. And yet these same people seem to be willing, when they get into the political arena, to inflict all sorts of coercion on other people at a distance. Do you have an explanation for this and then possibly a solution?
I think the explanation for why people who would never go next door to their neighbor and use a gun on them will vote to use a gun on them for their other purposes through government just don't realize what they're doing. They are, again, if I may say, ignorant or unknowledgeable or like little children. They have not understood what is happening. Sometimes when you confront them with what you believe is happening, they don't want to readily accept it because it's a hard thing to accept, especially for someone who believes themselves to be a very loving person. And that is why when we bring these things to the attention of other people who believe they are helping others by using the guns of government against their neighbors, it must be done with as much compassion as possible. Certainly, many of you in this room, myself included, can remember a time when I was not libertarian. I look back at some of the things I would have voted for if I'd have been old enough, and I cringe. So I know a little bit about the mortification of standing in the wrong place on the issues. And certainly I have sympathy for those who have done so, especially those who have done so all their life and are just now waking up. It's a hard transition to make. So my suggestion is that you give them as much support and sympathy as you can when they're making this transition. If they're
Mary's comment, just real quick, reminded me, actually a couple instances happened with me, and talking to my friends regarding the stadium tax, with Hamilton County, and I'd ask them the moral question. Libertarians, we always ask the moral question. I says, well, is it right to force people who are not customers of private for-profit businesses to pay for those businesses? Yeah, it's wrong. So why are you supporting the sales tax for the stadium? And I could tell in their hearts, they know what the answer was, that they were voting for something that was not right. And, I didn't grab them by the lapel. I kind of gently, and, that's all you needed to do. So it is key to do it with compassion, even whether it's friends or strangers, because they really do know in their hearts what the issue is. And hopefully there's enough there that eventually at some point they'll say, this is enough, I have to stop doing this. So thank you very much, Mary. As always, I enjoy her, and buy her book. It's excellent read. I've read it twice already, and it's super.